Thank you for coming out this morning. I know people have different reasons for choosing their chairs. I'd like to believe that you were optimistic that the other chairs down front would need to be filled in at the last minute. I'll keep my fingers crossed. I didn't really know what kind of audience we'd have this morning, so I'm trying to pitch the talk at different levels and trying to engage you in different issues related to King's thoughts about nonviolence. And I'll start perhaps most prosaically with a little story about my car ride home from school the other day. Last Tuesday, I think last Tuesday was the 15th, my daughter piped up from the back seat and she said, "Daddy, did you know that today is Dr. King's real birthday?" I said, "Yes, I think I did know that." And she said, she asked a number of similar questions. You know, the usual stuff about his birth in Atlanta, his death in Memphis, I Have a Dream speech in D.C. All those came up. And then she raised what I thought was the more interesting question, at least for me. And she said, "Daddy, did you know that Dr. King was nonviolent?" I thought, well. And so I said, yes. And let me ask you a question. Do you know why Dr. King was nonviolent? And she thought about it for a little while. She said, "Well, it's kind of complicated." Well, I agree with her assessment, okay? So today what I want to do, in honor of Clara at least, my daughter, is to begin sketching some of the rationales that King gave for nonviolent resistance. So by now, it seems like everyone, my second grade daughter included, knows that Martin Luther King Jr. was an advocate of nonviolence, of nonviolent resistance, more accurately. However, his precise rationale for advocating nonviolence remains too often forgotten these days. With that in mind, there are at least three basic things that I want to do this morning, and they're pretty basic. First, I want to offer a brief overview of King's argument for nonviolence. Specifically, I want to revisit this question. Was his a fundamentally moral or merely practical, even expedient, commitment to nonviolent resistance? Second thing I want to do, I want to highlight the theological commitments that lay back behind King's dedication to nonviolence. I'll make that part quick and painless for those who aren't theologically inclined. In other words, just how crucial was King's Christian faith to his nonviolent way of life? And the third thing I want to do, I want to examine whether King's commitment to nonviolence can still appeal to those who don't share his theological commitments. Right? For King, the theological plays a necessary role in the ethical argument for nonviolence. However, need it do so for everyone? Could there be non-theological reasons to remain hopeful about nonviolent resistance even today? So on to the first big question. Why did Martin Luther King Jr. reject violence in the pursuit of justice? Did he reject it the way a moral absolutist might? Because unjust, in this case violent, means always ought to be rejected, regardless of their effectiveness. In other words, was King's rationale close to the well-known Stoic adage, "Do justice, though the heavens fall"? Or instead, did King reject violence the way a realist, a practical realist, a political realist, or consequentialist might? Because in his case, in his particular case at least, violent means simply weren't going to produce the ends he desired. Now, granted, the theoretical difference between those two rationales might not have made any difference in Dr. King's case. Given either approach, he still might have advocated nonviolent resistance. However, I think that theoretical difference does make a huge practical difference for those of us following in King's footsteps. After all, if King's rationale was absolutist, then would-be King emulators would also have to embrace nonviolence. Again, regardless of its practicality, regardless of its promise of success. On the other hand, if King's rationale was more realist, then King's 21st century followers get to ask, well, in my case, what's going to work? Violence or nonviolence? So the question's an important one, I think. What was King's rationale? Which mattered more to him, the intrinsic morality of his approach or its actual ability to succeed? In this first part of the talk, I want to underscore the fact that King was equally concerned about both. He was, in effect, both an absolutist and a realist, believe it or not. More precisely, King was what I call and the term's not a perfect one, a moral pragmatist, for whom the moral alone stands a chance of being practically effective, at least in the long run. So let's start with a look back at the moral and the practical as they appear in King's life. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, little Michael King Jr., King's name until he was 5, wasn't born an advocate of nonviolent resistance. Yet the story of his personal conversion to nonviolence, what he called in equally religious terms, his pilgrimage to nonviolence, testifies to a long-standing commitment to both practical effectiveness and moral means of success. During his early days at Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, King was uncertain about the path of nonviolence at first. In his own later words, I had about concluded that the ethics of Jesus were only effective in individual relationships. When racial groups or nations clashed, a more realistic approach seemed necessary. As King tells the story, though, that attitude began to change, and you probably heard the story, one Sunday afternoon in 1950, when, as a 21-year-old seminarian, he made the short trip over to Philadelphia to hear Howard University President Mordecai Johnson's talk on Gandhi. As King later remembered, Johnson's lecture was so profound and electrifying that I left the meeting and bought a half-dozen books on Gandhi's life and works. As I delved deeper into the philosophy of Gandhi, my skepticism concerning the power of love gradually diminished. After reading Gandhi, I saw how utterly mistaken I was. To push the point, it seems as though King embraced a philosophy of nonviolence only once he was convinced that it worked practically and politically. In his memoir, The Montgomery Bus Boycott, Stride Toward Freedom, King admitted that well before Johnson's talk, he'd already heard plenty of passionate pleas for pacifism. Yet King remained unconvinced, since, as he once put it, perhaps my faith in love was temporarily shaken by the philosophy of Nietzsche. As a result, I had about despaired of the power of love in solving social problems. Now, what deserves attention here, I think, is a certain indeterminacy in King's early position towards nonviolence. Right? He had about despaired of the power of love, but only about. Likewise, he had only about concluded that the ethics of Jesus were only effective in individual relationships. King's words suggest that in those early days, he found himself locked in a state of limbo, stuck somewhere between pacifism and realism, unwilling to accept either fully. What he sought instead was a way of reconciling his deep Christian commitment to love, something that to King's mind, at least, precluded physical violence, with his similarly deep, equally Christian commitment to helping the oppressed. In his own words, he needed a, and I quote, morally and practically sound method. And as the photo over King's dinner table in Atlanta, you've probably seen it, later implied, Gandhi's track record with nonviolent resistance provided him the assurance that he could have his liberationist cake and eat it nonviolently too. By some reports, though, King needed further convincing that he could actually love all his brothers, black and white, even after that initial conversion experience in the city of brotherly love. 5 years after Johnson's talk in Philly, the Montgomery Improvement Association's commitment to nonviolence, at least during its earliest days, 1955, 1956, was by many accounts half-hearted at best. By King's own admission, the great majority of black Montgomeryans did not believe in nonviolence as a philosophy of life. True, they may have applauded when King called for nonviolence in this particular case, something he did during his very first speech after Rosa Parks' arrest in December of 55. However, whether they would remain committed to the approach, particularly in the face of setbacks and white violence, remained to be seen. Black Montgomery's commitment, and King's, was pretty soon tested when the King home was bombed a little over a month into the boycott. Arriving home from a Montgomery Improvement Association meeting on the night of January the 30th, this is 1956, King found wife Coretta, newborn Yoki, and a church friend at the back of the house when the bomb went off, rattled but uninjured. However, arriving home that night, King also found a gun-toting crowd of angry friends and supporters gathering on his front lawn. Coretta later said of that moment that it was, and I'm quoting Mrs. King, in some ways the most important hour of his life, the first deep test of his Christian principles and his theories of nonviolence. after King had calmly dispersed the crowd, reminding them that Jesus cries out across the centuries, "Love your enemies," and assuring them that we must meet violence with nonviolence, hate with love, one white police officer reportedly turned to another to say that they both owed King their lives that night. Yet despite his repeated appeals for nonviolence, even in these early days, including this very dramatic case, King confessed to having owned a gun in those days. In fact, he went so far as to apply at the sheriff's office to keep an additional gun in his car, an application that was, no surprise, denied by the white authorities there in Montgomery. King explained years later that his motivation had simply been to appease worried friends and family members, the same motivation he cited for employing armed bodyguards at the time as well. However, pacifist community organizer Glenn Smiley thought differently when he first arrived to help out with the bus boycott. Smiley worried that King's own commitment to nonviolence was not yet a hard and fast one. In Smiley's view, King's possession of weapons, together with his endorsement of nonviolence, testified to a troubling inconsistency. In that winter of '56, Smiley wrote to members of his pacifist organization, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, that, and I'm quoting Smiley, "King sees the inconsistency, but not enough. He believes, and yet he doesn't believe." Smiley was especially concerned that King might lapse into violence if the going got tough, since he is, this is Smiley's words, too young, and some of his close help is violent. Especially disturbed by the number of guns owned by both King himself and his supporters, Smiley went so far as to say, and I quote, "The place is an arsenal." Now, while there remains some debate over the accuracy of that last report, Smiley's observations indicate that King's commitment at least appeared essentially provisional at that time, dependent upon nonviolent resistance's practical effects. By many accounts, the 27-year-old leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association found a much-needed refresher on Gandhi's thought in Richard Gregg's The Power of Nonviolence, a 1956 gift from Smiley that King called a lasting influence on my life. Accordingly, one might conclude that the young preacher needed further proof that what he had heard and read about India could in fact apply to Jim Crow Alabama as well. More to the point, what he needed once again was assurance that the moral could in fact work, that it could be practical. At the very least, King was well aware that his supporters needed further proof on that point. Consequently, King made room in each of his speeches for both moral and practical arguments in favor of nonviolent resistance. At 1956's NAACP convention in San Francisco, King observed, "To use the method of violence would be both impractical and immoral. The black community in the United States," he explained, "possesses neither the instruments nor the techniques of violence," a judgment he stood by throughout his career. 11 years later, and where do we go from here? King cautioned his audience, and this is an audience at this point increasingly courted by violent strains within the civil rights movement. He cautioned them against the impracticality of black violence because the white international community possessed greater wealth and greater military power than all non-white people of the world combined. Fantasies of, and I quote King now, "a day when the oppressed people of color will violently rise together to throw off the yoke of white oppression are beyond the realm of serious discussion." Sufficient proof of violent insurrection's dismal chances of success had already been well demonstrated, King thought, by the fact that fewer people, and these are King's words, fewer people have been killed in 10 years of nonviolent demonstrations across the South than were killed in one night of rioting in Watts. In addition to these negative effects of violent resistance, King's speeches also regularly highlighted the positive results of nonviolence. In a 1961 commencement address at historically black Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, King answered the question, "Does nonviolent resistance bring results?" by telling his audience simply to look at the record. The technique's effectiveness could be seen in the recent integration of lunch counters in more than 142 cities of the Deep South, as well as in the ongoing efforts of the Freedom Rides, which had brought segregationist signs down from bus stations in Alabama that had never been down before. Dramatic results like these surely garnered support for the movement among the undecided, including members of Lincoln's own graduating class, one assumes. However, tales of nonviolence's practicality were clearly important to more than just the undecided. They were encouraging to its advocates and practitioners as well. As the leader of a social movement, King simply couldn't afford to turn a blind eye towards prudential effectiveness. In fact, James Cone, father of black theology, argues that it's his emphasis on the practical that is one of Dr. King's foremost contributions to the black community. As Cone notes, nonviolent direct action, and these are Cone's words, was the only creative way that an African American minority of 10% could fight for freedom and at the same time avoid genocide, the logical consequence of racism. Ironically, in Cone's estimation, King's nonviolent resistance was in fact the policy of a political realist, whereas Malcolm X's ostensibly realist endorsement of any means necessary was actually an idealistic, or more to Cone's point, an unrealistic stance. Here's Cone. As Malcolm spoke to the visceral feelings of African Americans, Martin spoke to the political realities implicit in their minority status. Interestingly enough, King offered a similar reading, not of himself, but of Jesus in one of his earliest sermons from his seminary days. In it, King corrected those who saw Jesus' nonviolent teachings as those of an impractical idealist. Rather, Jesus was, in King's own language, a practical realist. Yet because of King's heavy emphasis on the practical, one might still mistakenly conclude that he was a mere realist. Community organizer Saul Alinsky presents that sort of interpretation, not of King, but of Gandhi in 1971's Rules for Radicals. According to Alinsky, the unqualified rejection of immoral means is always a privileged belief. It's espoused by the haves to keep the have-nots from power. Consequently, Gandhi's seemingly absolutist adoption of nonviolence must have been essentially pragmatic at heart. It couldn't have been absolutist, in fact. Indeed, with Gandhi and King both, all this moral talk in support of nonviolent resistance must have been in some sense disingenuous. In Alinsky's judgment, and these are Alinsky's words, the morality which surrounded this policy of passive resistance was to a large degree a rationale to cloak a pragmatic program with a desired and essential moral cover. In other words, in Alinsky's estimation, Gandhi's moral rhetoric, like King's after him, was just that, rhetoric, employed merely for its practical effectiveness and so easily discarded given a different set of circumstances. Though Alinsky's right to point up the vital role that practical effectiveness must play in a successful social movement, King's appeal to the moral need not be a mere cover for practicality. Rather, what I want to show now is the way King's particular worldview, a theologically informed worldview, undergirded and animated his moral pragmatism. And more specifically, undergirded and animated his faith in the deep and persistent interconnection between the moral and the practical. And so that brings me to my second main point, that King's commitment to nonviolence was not only equally moral and practical, it was so because it was also fundamentally theological. In effect, King's Christian faith saved him from having to choose between an impractical absolutism on the one hand and an immoral realism on the other. Now, let me step back a second and say that one of the big debates about nonviolent resistance is whether it always works or whether it just sometimes works. Namely, when certain preconditions, social and political preconditions, have first been met. Now here's where things get tricky, I think. King leans at times towards the preconditions view, it seems, suggesting once again that his is a thoroughly practical, non-absolutist commitment to nonviolence. Now, let me try to show you what I mean. In a recent book about nonviolent revolutions, sociologist Sharon Erickson Nepstead offers a list of 4 conditions for successful nonviolent revolution. And though her study doesn't focus on the American Civil Rights Movement explicitly, Nepstad's list is largely anticipated in King's life story. And this is more important. It's largely anticipated by things King himself said about the Civil Rights Movement. First precondition, new political opportunities or moral shocks give rise to successful nonviolent revolutions. In King's case, it's certainly no coincidence that the Montgomery bus boycott took advantage of the political opportunities created the previous year by Brown v. Board of Education. In fact, in his first speech of the boycott, King makes that connection explicit, assuring his audience that if we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. Second precondition in Nepstad's list, the availability of free spaces is essential for successful nonviolent movements. The Montgomery movement during the bus boycott was no doubt benefiting from the availability of black churches in town, including the Holt Street Baptist Church, where King first spoke to an overflowing crowd of bus boycotters. In fact, King regularly acknowledged from that very first speech in Montgomery to his very last speech in Memphis the night before he died, the night before he was killed, that in a less free, more totalitarian regime, the black community might not have had the same ability to organize and protest their unjust mistreatment. Third precondition, significant economic hardship generally precedes successful nonviolent movements, Nepstad says. And while reliable measures of poverty in this country were unavailable in King's day, estimations for that time, approximately 22% of the U.S. population in poverty, suggest that poverty in the mid-50s, both inside and outside the black community, may have been an even worse problem then than it is today. In his final years, King's Poor People's Campaign assumed that the best participants in a social revolution would be the poor, those who have nothing to lose, and those who have no job calling them back home. And the fourth precondition, divided elites, or at least potentially dividable elites, are, according to Nepstad, a crucial requirement for successful nonviolent revolution. Right? The support of President Johnson against Governor Wallace played a substantial role in King's mid-60s success, and of course the Supreme Court's support for integration, not only in Brown v. Board of Education, but also in the Montgomery bus case, had already demonstrated an important division among the nation's powerful white elites. However, over and above Nepstad's four preconditions, and first on most lips when I discuss this issue with other people, is an additional fifth precondition. Crudely put, for nonviolent resistance to work, the oppressor must not be all that bad. As a seminary student, King had become aware of theologian Reinhold Niebuhr's belief that nonviolent resistance might only be successful if the groups against whom the resistance was taking place had some degree of moral conscience. True, arguments like Niebuhr's probably serve first and foremost to draw a comforting bright line between those who are truly evil, the Nazis for instance, and those who aren't so bad, British colonizers and American racists, with whom line drawer is more closely identified. Yet it's understandable that many believe nonviolent resistance simply couldn't have worked had the Jews used it, for instance, against oppressors willing to gas them and slaughter them by the millions. Now, King clearly acknowledges all these preconditions at times. However, while he acknowledges their importance, he never suggests that they play a necessary role in the movement's success. More to the point here, in King's view, there aren't just political or social preconditions that give rise to the success of nonviolence, though those certainly don't hurt. In addition, rather, there are all important theological preconditions in place. In fact, and here's the crucial point, because these theological preconditions are, King believed, always in place, then nonviolent resistance may be the best method for realizing justice in every case. No exceptions. As I've indicated, from King's point of view, the moral and the practical are not only equally indispensable in the pursuit of justice, they are in fact inextricably intertwined. In his Lincoln University address, King rejected what he labeled a Machiavellian belief that ends can justify means. A belief that, in his own words, tends to force a sort of duality within the moral structure of the universe. From King's thoroughly theological perspective, there is no such duality, no incompatibility between the moral and the practical. For theological reasons, King rejects, as he says, communism and all those systems which argue that the end justifies the means. In so saying, King apparently rejects any sort of realist or consequentialist perspective. However, he does so in an unexpected, perhaps even slightly paradoxical way. King rejects the belief that a just end has the power to justify violent means, not because an end has no bearing on the moral evaluation of the means, but rather because violent means necessarily lack the power to produce truly just ends. In King's well-known words, we realize that the end is pre-existent in the means. In the long run of history, destructive means cannot bring about constructive ends. And for King, both Scripture and history testify to that fact. Quoting Matthew's Jesus, King declares, "He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword." History is replete with the bleached bones of nations who failed to hear these words. In fact, King's heavy emphasis on the practical, don't forget it, reveals itself in his own follow-up claim to that previous one. And so, we decided to use the method of nonviolence, feeling that violence would not do the job. Again, King adopts an absolutely moral method because it alone can produce desirable consequences. And that's the case for inescapably theological reasons. Because, as King repeatedly said, the universe is on the side of justice. In more explicitly theological terms, and I'm quoting King, I have felt the power of God transforming the fatigue of despair into the buoyancy of hope, and I am convinced that the universe is under the control of a loving purpose, and that in the struggle for righteousness, man has cosmic companionship. There is a tendency, I admit, to wonder which commitment, the moral or the practical, plays the more influential role in King's nonviolence. Yet to the hypothetical question, okay, what might King have done if the moral weren't practical? There's no answer. Prior to reading Gandhi, King had remained in a paralyzed limbo. The question frames an unanswerable dilemma for Dr. King. It asks how King might have ranked his moral Christian commitment to nonviolence against his equally moral, equally Christian commitment to effective social justice for the oppressed. Both commitments spring not only from the same source, namely King's Christian faith, but indeed from a source that reassures him that no such choice will ever be ultimately necessary. The moral is practical, and the immoral impractical. After all, because this world we live in is created and directed by a moral and loving God. To strip King of that view is in all likelihood to strip him of both his commitment to nonviolence and his motivations for social justice. In fact, it is in all likelihood to strip him of his identity as Martin Luther King Jr., a third-generation Baptist minister. One might as well ask, what might King have done if he hadn't been convinced of the existence of a loving moral God in our universe? King's view, like King's identity, is, in other words, inescapably theological. Now, in response to King's potential critics on this point, I should probably quickly explain what King's moral pragmatism does not entail. First, when King denies the immoral the ability to be practical, King is not saying that on the flip side, the moral, that is, any employment of moral means, is always necessarily practical and successful. Right? Prudence has to be used to decide among morally acceptable courses of action. 2, nor is King saying that the immoral can't, quote, succeed for a time, even for a long time. The Jim Crow South and the slaveholding South before that serve as evidence enough on that point. 3, King is not even saying that the moral, prudential application of a moral means will be miraculously free of setbacks, that it'll be able to bring about immediate, long-lasting results. Right? He repeatedly warns of inevitable setbacks. That's his phrase, inevitable setbacks to be endured by the movement's supporters. The death of 4 girls in a Birmingham church in 1963, like King's own assassination 5 years later, were especially painful setbacks for the movement. But from King's perspective, they would be no proof that the universe is no longer on the side of justice. So there's one last question I want to approach today. Namely, could King's audacious faith in nonviolent resistance be shared by those who don't share his theological commitments? In other words, are there any non-theological, even naturalistic reasons to remain on the side of nonviolent resistance? Now, let me be clear. King himself was sometimes dubious about that possibility. Though he acknowledged that, and I'm quoting King, there are devout believers in nonviolence who find it difficult to believe in a personal God. Even these persons believe in the existence of some creative force that works for universal wholeness. However, let me outline another and somewhat more optimistic answer to the question. In another recently published book on nonviolent resistance, Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffen reject Nepstad and Niebuhr's preconditionalism, right? The notion that certain preconditions have to be in place for nonviolence to actually work, concluding that, and these are their words, nonviolent resistance has the potential to succeed in nearly all situations in which violent resistance is typically used, and to more favorable ends in the longer term. Through an empirical study of 4 20th century civil resistance movements, Chenoweth and Steffen contend most boldly that, and I'm quoting, insurgents who claim that violent resistance is necessary are probably always wrong. Why? Because, among other things, nonviolent resistance has the ability, in contrast to violent resistance movements, to garner more external supporters and more internal participants. It also has the ability, and this is an important point, to cultivate in those participants vital social and political capabilities, virtues, if you will, to be employed following the revolution. In King's own view, nonviolent resistance has the ability both to provoke the conscience of the oppressors, as well as third-party bystanders, and to lift up the oppressed themselves. What King says about an imagined healthcare movement might make these points clearer. In one of his very last publications, The Trumpet of Conscience, King advised the poor people of Mississippi to make another march on Washington, this time demanding not just jobs and freedom, as in 1963, but decent medical treatment as well. King writes, "If you are, let's say, from rural Mississippi, and have never had medical attention, and your children are undernourished and unhealthy, you can take those little children into the Washington hospitals and stay with them there until the medical workers cope with their needs. And in showing it your children, you will have shown this country a sight that will make it stop in its busy tracks and think hard about what it has done." Now, while the feasibility of moving scores of sick, malnourished children from the Mississippi Delta up to the D.C. hospitals may pose some profound logistical obstacles, ones that unfortunately Dr. King didn't get a chance to resolve, it's tempting, for me at least, to think that doing so might have had a profound impact on healthcare reform in this country. And yes, it would do so, King speculates, by moving the moral conscience of oppressors and bystanders. However, just as importantly, it would do so by cultivating the social and political capabilities or virtues of those who participated in the process, those who organized it and those who took part in it. In effect, there's a virtue ethicist inside Dr. King that means to point out the way realists and consequentialists alike seem to misunderstand the end that they're actually pursuing. Simply put, King's intermingling of the moral and the practical reminds us that ends and means should never be entirely divorced, even for thoroughly secular ethicists, in no small part because it's the moral character of a community's inhabitants that's the crucial aspect of the end social justice pursues. In other words, what consequentialists and political realists seem to forget is that the consequences that supposedly justify morally questionable means include the consequences to the moral character of both those who use the immoral means and those misused by them. In effect, there's something self-defeating in the realist's recommendation that people employ injustice to bring about justice. What King makes clear then is the fact that realists and consequentialists might rightly focus on reality. It matters. And consequences, they matter, but might nevertheless greatly misconstrue which consequences and which realities matter most, namely the moral character of the beloved community's members. At the very least, what King, as a kind of virtue ethicist, makes clear is the way in which the use of unjust means has far-reaching effects on the moral character of all involved. The realist's confidence that one could simply use immoral means to achieve a certain end and then move into a more benign moral relationship is, King would argue, morally naive. It's naive about the power of habit, and it's naive about the power of moral precedent in human life. However, and here's my final point, if King, Chenoweth, and Stephan are right, namely that nonviolence always stands the greatest chance of long-term success, in fact, if King's more extreme position, that nonviolence alone stands a chance of long-term success, if that is right, then there should be no outlying cases in which nonviolent resistance is ruled out as an appropriate technique, right? Contrary to Niebuhr's assumptions, then, nonviolent resistance might have been effective even in the toughest possible case, the case of the Nazis. Now, I've only got a minute left, I think. You can imagine I hesitate to make that claim here this morning, in no small part because doing so might risk blaming the victims of the past for their own persecution. So I don't want to do that. However, if King's audacious optimism about nonviolence is to guide today's justice advocates forward, then it has to stand up to this Nazi challenge. To skeptics on the point, Jacques Semelin has cataloged ways that European communities used nonviolent techniques to save countless Jews from persecution. They range, of course, from hiding Jews in attics and cellars, through non-cooperation with Nazi forces by local police, to Denmark's decision to transport thousands of Jews to nearby Sweden. However, most suggestive of all, perhaps, is the so-called Rosenstrasse incident. Though there's disagreement about the particular details, 1943 saw the last remaining Jews of Berlin rounded up for deportation. Among them, 1,800 members of so-called mixed-race families, Jewish husbands with non-Jewish wives in most cases. However, when those Jews were held at the Rosenstrasse detention center, a grassroots movement sprung up in which wives gathered en masse each day for a week, demanding the release of their loved ones. Ignoring both the bitter cold of those late winter days, as well as repeated threats of machine gun fire, the women maintained their place in the streets, and in the end, the husbands were released. Granted, the protesters in this case were not Jews themselves. Granted, this was a pretty small-scale incident. Granted, there's a lot of debate over the particular details here. However, the story remains powerfully suggestive. Again, not so much of the fact that nonviolent resistance would have worked in the case of the Nazis, but rather it remains powerfully suggestive and encouraging that nonviolent resistance might even work in the most unlikely cases and in the most unlikely places, even with prudent employment at least, within the most apparently hopeless circumstances. King's example, like the Rosenstrasse story, challenges us to rethink justice's alleged need for violence. That is, King's example poses a challenge to each of us when we find ourselves tempted to jump prematurely to the conclusion that the situation we're in is the exceptional one, right? The one that requires violence. After all, King's supporters have been concluding the same thing about the Deep South over the years, from the night his house was bombed back during the first month of the bus boycott, through the attack on marchers crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, to the night King was murdered in Memphis. King knew the human tendency to idolize violence. The civil rights movement's unanticipated successes in the 50s and 60s challenge us to hope that nonviolent resistance could be effective, perhaps in every case. In effect, what studies like Chenoweth and Steffens or Simmelins provide is further practical backing to King's provocative challenge to have faith, regardless of our theologies or atheologies, that as humans, and I'm quoting King now, we are not lost in a universe fighting for goodness and for justice and for love all by ourselves. Thank you. Yeah, 1 or 2 minutes.
I was wondering if you think that social media has had any kind of impact since Dr. Martin Luther King's days in terms of the success of nonviolent movements?
Yes. I don't know a lot about the recent movements in the Islamic world, but it seems that they've played a role there, and that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, King certainly took advantage of the developing medium of television to accomplish a lot of his ends. I mean, it's hard to imagine that the Birmingham protest would have worked as well if people around the world hadn't seen the kids being hosed down. So similarly, I imagine Dr. King would be on Facebook, or at least he'd have some people on Facebook working for him. SNCC would have been on Facebook, right? Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they would have been on Facebook, I suspect. Do you have other thoughts about that?
I think one of the reasons why people do think whether a violent response is sometimes absolutely necessary is that where soul force, which is the term that Gandhi preferred and which I think has a more positive quality. I'm kind of sorry that nonviolence took over from soul force as the effective term. Slavery ended in the United States as a result of a terrible war, but between 1820 and 1890, everywhere else in the Americas, slavery ended with little or no violence. Nation after nation, state after state in the United States, rich places, middle-class places, poor places, governments of Catholic, Protestant, and secular character, people that spoke many different languages, they all ended slavery with almost no or absolutely no violence. The dictatorships associated with fascism in Spain, and Portugal, the dictatorships associated with communism in Eastern Europe collapsed with little or no violence, including the Soviet Union in the long run. It did take a terrible war to put a stop to Nazism in Germany. The war contributed to the collapse of fascism in Italy, although it was probably on its last legs anyway. But the truth is that organized and careful, and in some cases deeply covert opposition, persisting over years, and persisting in many cases, though by no means all, under religious inspiration, did bring down dictatorship, did bring down slavery. It is not impossible that the same can bring down the terrorist forces that quite legitimately terrorize us now.
Mm-hmm. Is there a question there? I'm in optimistic agreement, though I'm hesitant to.
All I said was quite possible.
Exactly, to rule out the use of force.
Was King's moral pragmatism necessarily political? It seems like he wouldn't be on board with just sitting at home writing an ethical treatise, but that you actually have to try it out in the world. Like if he's holding the means and the ends together.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's not a theory, right? It's a way of life, and it's one that becomes increasingly attractive and appealing and convincing to him as it works. I mean, yeah, and he says that, and he says that it's through the process of watching these things work and getting better at deploying them, right? It doesn't always work. Albany, Georgia was a disaster. Birmingham, a greater success for all sorts of reasons. But he says that the experience is not only convincing him of the power of nonviolence, but it also is actually convincing him, he says, of the existence of a personal God. He didn't sort of waltz in with everything he needed theoretically and even theologically, now let's go. There's a dialogue between the thinking and the acting, certainly. And the acting's playing a huge role. Yeah. Time for one more? One last one?
This is an easy one. What was the picture over his dining room table?
Just Gandhi.
Oh. Thanks.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Thank you.